The Chevrolet Corvette C6 Z06, to many, despite this car being nearly 2 generations old, is still the Corvette to have. It's powered by the LS7, a 7-liter pushrod V8 that winds out to 7,000 RPM, makes 505 horsepower and 470 foot-pounds of torque. So in this video, we're going to be walking you through what made this car so special when it first came out in 2006 with the help from General Motors engineers. We're going to be putting this thing up on the lift and then taking it for a drive around Autobahn Country Club. Before I briefly walk you through the cabin space of the C6 Z06, I'm going to walk you through what they did to the exterior. The Z06 was the first wide-body offering in the C6 lineup. It is nearly 3 inches wider than the regular C6 Corvette and only comes as a hardtop for maximum body rigidity. The front of this vehicle has 2 larger inlets. It has an air intake inlet on the top of the hood, and the front opening is made a little bit wider to feed the oil cooler, radiator, and trans cooler. This car still maintains the openings in the rear fenders for the brake cooling as well. The interior space, however, is essentially a direct carryover. And I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room. Mark brings this up all the time when it comes to Corvette interiors of this generation, is that they are subpar or inadequate. And I will say this is a peak mid-2000s GM cabin space. While I'm not saying the ergonomics are poor, but many of the material choices and fit and finish does not hold up to modern car standards. It's probably worse than what you find in many modern economy cars. But despite that, what makes Corvettes great is that they are very usable. The C5 through C7, from an ergonomics perspective, are all largely the same. They are fairly large cabins for a dedicated sports car, and all of them offer a very usable hatch space. And because of the hatch, this makes it one of the most practical dedicated sports cars you could probably buy. I used my C7 when I owned it as a daily driver for the first year, and it fulfilled most of my needs, which you can't say about all sports cars that have this level of performance. While they made running changes to this cabin over the years, adding more sound deadening, changing some of the trim packages, and even changing the seat design slightly, the seats, along with really some of the overall fit and finish of this car, are the primary negative of this cabin. They don't breathe particularly well, they don't hold you in when you're cornering hard, but they are soft. So if you are going to cruise in this car, they're fine, other than the sweaty back you'll end up with. But with all of that out of the way, I think it's time for us to head into the shop and put this thing up on the lift.
You're here with us underneath the C6 Z06 Corvette, Jack. And let's just get this out of the way from my part. I'm not going to be too involved in all the changes and the engineering on this, not because I don't care, but Jack knows far more about this. In fact, he has had the opportunity to talk with the small block team that has worked on this engine family or variations of it since the dawn of time, and this is very rare. And after watching the interview, spending the time with them, I have a much greater appreciation for this car. And yes, I'm so grateful that you're excited about this, and I'm actually getting to learn along with you as Jack explains some of the changes that were made to this generation.
So this is the C6 Z06. This is the famous LS7 powered Corvette. For many people, this is the ultimate Corvette that is still front engined. The C6 was sold for many, many years, and the C6 Z06 was sold from like 2006 when it was first introduced to like 2013, 2014 time period. And because it was around for a long time, there were a ton of different updates that they made to the car, which you expect with a sports car that's been around for a long period of time. Think ND1, ND2 Miata, S2000, AP1, AP2. They made changes to gearbox, motor, oiling system, interior, and the aerodynamics of the vehicle. But all of these cars at their core are essentially the same, which means they are double wishbone front and rear with leaf springs front and rear like you get in the C5, C6, and C7 Corvette. This car, being a Z06, introduced their more exotic material strategies to body structures in a big way to the Corvette lineup. So the frame of this vehicle, the body structure, is all aluminum with aluminum extrusions in the side pillars for the vehicle. It has a magnesium front subframe, which is lighter and more rigid than you would get with a steel subframe, and all the individual suspension components are aluminum, which is a big deal. The front dampers and springs are slightly more aggressive than you get in a regular C6. However, the rear sway bar and spring rates are substantially higher. They wanted this car to take advantage of the fact that it is a wide body, which means the front carbon fiber fenders are far wider, which means they can put bigger tires in the front. So I think this car is running a 275 stock in the front, but if you are going aftermarket like I do on my C7, you can go up to a 315 front tire, which is massive. The dampers are monotubes front and rear. However, in later modeled cars, with the Z07 package, you could get an early iteration of MagnaRide dampers. This car, again, got changed model year to model year. The steering rack also had a fairly large change in like the '08 timeframe. This is not an EPS rack, it's hydraulic. It is very assisted, which means there isn't the most feel. But in 2008, they went to a variable gear ratio steering rack to end some of the dartiness of the front end. These cars have a little bit of tram lining. And then in '09, the ratio increased or sped up to get the car to turn a little bit faster and feel a little bit more nimble. I think the other thing to note about the front end of this vehicle, much like you get on the C5 and the C7, is there's a lot of alignment capability, which if you are looking to track this car is a big plus of this vehicle. The vehicle is a wide body, as I mentioned earlier, and it has a coefficient of drag in 2009, which this model is, of about 0.34. Later models with the Z07 package, which I believe also increased the spring rate because of the larger tires, had a little bit more downforce with an extra aero package. The big change, before we talk about the engine, which Mark and I are both going to talk about when we get underneath the hood, is also the gearbox. In 2008, with the introduction of the LS3, they went from a T56 gearbox to a TR6060, which is a gearbox Mark and I are both very familiar with. It is stronger and has better shift action than the T56, but both are fairly reasonable gearboxes. The last thing to quickly talk about are brakes, Mark. They are 6-piston fronts. They are a very interesting pad setup, OEM or stock. They had individual pads for each one of the pistons. You can, however, retrofit a more traditional pad. I think they did that for piston pressure distribution on the rotors, and then with the Z07 package, you could get carbon ceramics. But Mark, I know I've talked these guys' ear off. Let's get underneath the hood.
Sounds good, Jack. Under the hood of the Z06 Corvette, Jack, I see LS7 stamped down here, and I know this is a big deal. And if you're not a GM person, all I hear is LTs, LZs, all these packages, all these numbers, but I'm assuming the LS7 stands for 7 liters of displacement.
I would assume so, Mark, because this is a very, very powerful, big engine that actually doesn't weigh a whole lot either. There was a unbelievable amount of engineering that went into this. And again, think about the time period. We're talking about 2006. So there were a lot of firsts for GM. And as you saw, I spent a lot of time with the engineering team, and it's not normal that an engineering team will spend time with you on a product that's 2 generations old.
It was a special place in history and time, I think, and it is aged very, very well. And I think we're starting to appreciate some of this type of technology maybe when we didn't when it came out. But explain to me a little bit what the mindset here was, Jack.
So when they developed the C6 Z06, they always had an idea for a high horsepower, naturally aspirated V8. And there were some development goals they wanted to meet. But instead of me explaining the story to you, let's cut to the engineers. With the C6 Z06, was the motor being developed specifically for this car in mind, or was it something already in the works ahead of time? How did that work? Why did you guys decide to put a 7-liter, relatively high-revving engine into a Corvette?
Yeah, it was targeted for the Z06. And I think early on, and you'll have to help me fill in some of the blanks, it wasn't going to be a 7-liter. We were going to do a higher output version of our 6.2, and we had some new cylinder heads, new camshafts for more power. And I think we're up around the 450 horsepower category or so. And I believe maybe it was the Mustang came out with more than that, or close to it. Do you remember?
Well, I mean, at the time, our highest performance small block was the LS6 in the C5, and that was at 405 horsepower. So obviously, we wanted to see what could we do to top that. And you're right, Jordan. Originally, the LS7 didn't start out as a 7-liter. It was actually a 6.4 liter. So it was going to be, it was going to be a 6.4. I think the program target was about 450 horsepower. But then at the time, the Dodge Viper was really the king as far as the horsepower from the big three. And the leadership said, okay, guys, you gotta top that. So what can you do to get even beyond that? And that's kind of where that Genesis started.
That's right. It was the Viper.
Right.
And they introduced a new number that was higher than what we were going to come out with. And yeah, we just couldn't have that. So a few of us got together, and the engine enthusiasts, June included, and we were just kicking around ideas what we could do to make more power. And I don't know who came up with the 7-liter and the bigger bore, but we all loved it. And we just latched onto it, and we rolled with it. And oddly enough, GM senior leadership didn't stand in our way. So we kind of got free reign to go ahead and make some changes late in the game to come up with the LS7.
So as they said, the Viper had come out and they wanted to hit that big boy horsepower number. So with the benefit of extra displacement, they got this thing to make 505 horsepower. The motor itself, despite being 7 liters, is very, very compact and very light. It only weighs, with the accessories, 454 pounds, which as a reference point, the 2-liter out of the S2000 weighs 350.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's very, very, very impressive. The fact that this thing winds out to 7,000 RPM is also amazing. Is one of the reasons why we love this. It's a motor that has a lot of character for a GM power plant. Like my LT1 out of my C7, which is 6.2 liter with direct injection, only revs at like 6,500 RPM. This revs to 7,000. Because of its massive bore and stroke, at least according to GM, this is actually one of the highest revving motors ever because of the sheer piston speed and size.
Yeah, so when you have a bore and stroke the way this does, and the piston size, and the fact that it is push rod with only 2 valves, you don't have a lot of air to work with. So the other part is reciprocating mass, and that's something they discussed with you, is when you have these big heavy parts that have to move and travel the way that the engine parts do, they had to go back to get this to rev, to overcome the physical part of the engine design. They had to do a lot of innovating in terms of lightweight materials, which is partly why the weight's so low, but what did they do here?
Titanium connecting rods, titanium valve train. They have a forged crankshaft and some other forged main parts of the motor as well. Oiling was a big deal. This is the first time they put a dry sump lubrication system in really
a production
car. They had 2 stages of this. The early version of this, which I'm not going to say they had a lot of problems with, but they had some problems with, was a lower capacity. Then later on, due to the ZR1, again, as I mentioned, underneath the car, they made some manufacturing improvements, took the dry sump out of the ZR1, so it went to 10.5 quarts. It's essentially the same dry sump that's out of the current generation C7. It's a divorced setup, so the reservoir is separate from the block.
That's a remote reservoir.
Yes, it's still a dry sump though.
And they use this technology once they started to sort it out. And this is something that's cool about sports cars that you don't typically see. And when we talk about a lot of these regular cars, we go and say, well, at the limit, and people get sick of hearing at the limit. Nobody drives that way. But this is how these cars get accelerated development, because you have people pushing the boundaries of what they can do, which means you accelerate things that break, accelerate those learning cycles. So these improvements came, like you said, every single year. They were trying to sort out what was good, and then you saw it carry into the future generation car and things that they wanted to do better. And the argument could be made with this is, why did they keep kind of this horse and carriage design for so long with leaf springs, the wood core, some of the things that were carried over. And as I listened to them talk, I think I had a better appreciation for the fact that when you have a team that has worked together for so long, the benefit of doing that is you take something that's proven, known, you have everything sorted out with it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. All you have to do is fix the things that are broken. And by throwing all of this away, they could have thrown this away, but in the time period that they had with the technology they had, there was no point of trying to reinvent the wheel when it probably would have made it worse. And I think they did. They evolved this car to the absolute max. They got every single thing done that they wanted to do with this C6 through C7 generation. And that's what you feel when you drive it.
The benefits of this being a push rod means due to packaging of the motor itself, it can be placed very low in the car and far back. Combine that with the transaxle, which again in this car's case is a TR6060, you have essentially a 50-50 weight distribution. And they tried their best to keep the weight out of the car. For example, the floors, the passenger floors in this car are a mix of carbon fiber and balsa wood. But the last thing I will talk about, which is the thing that everybody talks about with the LS7, is the valve train. This is the identical valve train that's actually used on LT4s and LT5s. It's the titanium valves with their guides, but the guides themselves early on developed a reputation for failures. But instead of me explaining to you what happened and the realities behind that, let's have the chief engineer.
I don't want to get onto the pain points, but that is something that I will 100% be asked about these motors. What were the teething pains with the LS7? How did you guys address them over its life cycle? Specific manufacturing changes, and then can you specifically elaborate on the valve guide failures of the LS7?
The valve guide stuff, I mean, that just took off on the internet. It's still a mystery to me how it just ballooned into something, into what it became. So the backstory there is that our cylinder heads were machined by an outside supplier. LS7 was low volume, so we didn't machine the cylinder heads and the cylinder blocks inside our big production factory. That was mostly for trucks and the high volume stuff. So this outside supplier would machine the cylinder heads. There was a machining defect in machining the ID of the valve guides, and the guides weren't machined. And I think that correctly, they actually were a little bit tight on the ends of the valve guide, but a little bit loose in the middle. And valve guides for titanium intake valves have to be a special material. So this is another part of the problem. Titanium is pretty abrasive. It wears other components very, very rapidly. It's abrasive material. So these valve guides in this batch of cylinder heads would get loose, and you would hear a valve ticking noise. But like I mentioned earlier, the valve train's noisy to begin with because of the aggressive timing. So you can hear ticking noise on even an engine that has all the valve guides machined to specification. So the web goes wild with these failures of claims of noisy valve train. Well, number one, the valve train's noisy by design. Number two, now they're spooked because they found out that there's another issue that may be brewing. And then people started to complain that valve heads were dropping off the valves, and we've never seen that in our production warranty. And we scoured warranty with a vengeance, even well after the LS7 was nearly out of production, to see if there was anything going on that we just didn't know about. And everything came back to this batch of heads that had mismachined guides. The valves were loose in the guides, and they clattered more than normal. We put the heads under extended warranty. We made good on them. Any customer that had problems would get their engine serviced under warranty without issue. But the old wives' tale lived on, that it was a terrible thing, and GM knew there was a problem. And if I can honestly tell you, if we thought there was a problem, we would have went after it with a vengeance. And we did our investigation, and we just couldn't come up with anything else. But Jack, we had the same valve guides and valves on the LS9, the same valve guides and valves on the LT4, then on the LT5. So if there was a design issue, it would have manifested itself, and it just wasn't.
So Mark, with that all out of the way.
Well, all those excuses, Jack, every car blew up, didn't it? This guy's engine's blown up 20 times. So, there's always going to be that internet argument versus the engineers, the people that are working on it. I mean, you're never going to get away with this. Every single sports car has some type of issue, and
reputation,
yes,
deserved or not deserved. But Mark, I think it's time for us to go to Autobahn Country Club and experience some high tea.
All right. Saw these flying around the autocross course in second gear. I thought the transmissions were broken, Jack, but no, it's the gearing. How are your T levels? They'll be higher if you make this braking zone. Man, this car's... You know what? It's weird. It feels so much faster in the passenger seat, but it could be also these seats are horrible. Yeah, they. Oh my God, are they horrible? Oh Jesus! They like do not hold you in at all.
See, in the driver's seat, because I can hold onto the steering wheel and the pedals, it's not so bad. Man, I love the front end of this car.
Yeah, considering you just annihilatedly blew that apex.
Yeah, well.
You're on the wrong side of the track turning in, bro.
Too much V8.
Is this your first track day?
Yeah, I forgot how to drive.
Yeah, I know you're used to your McLarens and Ferraris out here that drive.
My team wasn't out here for me.
Yeah, I was just going to call my team in and tell them to get the podium ready.
For driving out here by myself. All right, Mark.
Yeah,
Let's start talking about how this thing handles. It's a double wishbone car, so if you work with the front end will load up. I don't feel like it offers a lot of feel, as you were talking about, where you don't really, at least at my limited time with it on track, I don't have a great idea if it's about to understeer or start to wash out, but you can feel it load up.
Yeah, I think some of that is because you also have 3 degrees of negative front camber in this, where you're getting the maximum amount of grip that these tires have to offer. So it does do a good job. The fact that you can set it up for track like this is great. The other thing that I like to notice is it does get through the tight stuff way quicker than you would expect. This car is very, very nimble in the slow speed sections because the rear really rotates naturally without swinging all the way out, which is something that really surprised me. But I will say the negative part about the handling characteristics are at the higher speed stuff. High speed sweepers where you have a lot of like G-load on the lateral load, you feel just how disconnected the front and the rear end of this car are. It just feels far less rigid than the C7 like your car. And it has this horrible bobble effect as it's gripping and ungripping. You're just like all over the place, and it takes away a ton of my driver confidence pushing this thing.
You can feel the weight transfer in this car a lot. You can feel it dive under braking like right now. You can feel it squat under acceleration as well. But
I don't think that's a bad thing. Like, this is the slow stuff. Like, it's really natural, and the body roll and all that doesn't bother me. I'm just talking about the high speed stuff.
You mean like up here?
Yeah, like once you get this thing near 90 to 100 miles an hour and you just lean on it, it's like...
Yeah, you can feel the car, the front end is starting to porpoise as I'm loading it up.
Yep. But, the other thing too is this is on OTS Coney Yellows, and he did this obviously to be stock legal in autocross, so this is probably the best off-the-shelf shock you can get for that. So there's probably a lot of improvement with a real damper, but I would say I'm hyper impressed with this car. The gearbox and the engine, however, dominate the experience.
Yeah, this LS7 and this TR6 C60 are far superior to what's found in pretty much any C7.
It does, and it fixes a lot of the problem that you and I both have with like your C7. Is it's an amazing car, but the engine just feels like
synthetic V8.
Yeah, it's just like Grand Theft Auto V8, like perfect on a piece of paper, but very little emotion. This has a lot of emotion
for doing this. I can blow by Miatas at over 100 miles an hour.
Oh, you're so fast
with my 7 liters of displacement.
Yeah,
the brakes in this car are great. Even with a non-aggressive pad.
Yeah, he's got a hybrid autocross pad on here, and it's pretty good if you know the limits of what you're doing. I mean, you're not going to run a whole session foot to the floor, but the brakes show a lot of potential. And I think the bottom line for me, Jack, is this definitely transformed my opinion about this car. It's definitely not my favorite chassis in terms of like flex and just communication, but again, the engine and transmission, it makes it more of a complete package. I love driving it.
Yeah, I think the other thing I'm going to bring up really quickly before we wrap this up is the steering. It definitely feels of its era. It's not the quickest rack, even with its variable gear ratio steering. Compared to the C7, I actually feel like the EPS is better.
Yeah, the steering is really slow, and I mean, it's, again, like you said, for the customer base who was looking at this and the era it came out of, I mean, I don't expect much more of it.
Yeah, this car is, I think if you bought one between like $40,000 to $55,000, $60,000.
Yeah, when the market's right, I think if you get this for around 50, 55, and it's a good clean example, you're gonna love driving this. It's an amazing car. It's so fast out here.
So Mark, all right, let's head into the final thoughts.
All right, Jack, before I eject out of this seat.
Final thoughts on the C6 Z06 Corvette. I wanted to say this first. Huge thanks to Dan, the owner, who made this video possible and was kind enough to let us track his car, the small block engineering team at Chevrolet, who spent a lot of time with me, my reps at Chevrolet, like Trevor Tompkins, who's amazing to work with, and Autobahn Country Club, who, if you are in the Midwest and you're looking to do a track day or track day rental, I highly suggest you hit them up. So what about the car itself? Well, no surprise, the C6 Z06 is dominated by its V8. It sounds amazing, it feels great, and it hauls some serious ass. It is noticeably faster than my LT1 powered C7 Grand Sport in a straight line. The TR6060 feels great to use, it's relatively low effort, the gates are clear, and if you work with the fact that you have to be smooth with the car, you can haul some serious ass. Even 15 years later, the C6 Z06 is still an absolute weapon on the track. The steering in the C6, despite being hydraulic, isn't particularly fast and does not have that much feel. So the C7's EPS rack, because it's faster and more rigid, feels better to use and in some ways translates more feel to the front end. And the E-diff in the C7, despite not being necessarily as natural, is far more capable. It allows you to put power down earlier and in some ways can get you out of trouble. But despite that, the C6 is a car that when you are going flat out in, when you're on track and you're in rhythm with the car, a lot of its deficiencies go away and you are just in awe of the way the LS7 sounds, the way the shifter feels, and the fact that you are going ridiculously fast. So with that, thanks for watching and thank you to everyone who's involved in this video.